Hi there and welcome to the special on Times Lit Fest Delhi. We're very privileged to have with us former RBI Governor Professor Raghuram Rajan, who's going to talk to us about his new book, I Do What I Do, and also going to talk to us a little bit about the contemporary issues facing India today. Professor Rajan, thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, the government has just celebrated the first anniversary of demonetization. It's celebrated demonetization. Do you believe that there is cause for celebration?
You know, I was hoping we'd get away from a discussion of demonetization. Look, I think I will repeat what I said a few months ago, which is we still have to await the full evolution of the data. The costs have been upfront, and I think they should not be underestimated. There's been a lot of pain suffered by the informal sector. There's anecdotal evidence that many newspapers have reported about job losses, and I think activity has suffered. Set against this is the possibility of potentially better tax compliance, that the income tax authorities have a lot of data, and if they go about it carefully without harassing, innocent bystanders, it may result in a greater tax take over time. The possibilities are out there in the future. The costs have already happened. We have to wait and see how it plays out. Is it an occasion for celebration? I think it's important to emphasize the message that we need better tax compliance in this country. And to the extent we can do it without unleashing a Inspector Raj, I think it's important. I think it's important that people pay up. And to that extent, symbolic occasions are useful, but we shouldn't sort of overemphasize when we don't know the benefits.
Another theme that you've spoken about in your book, and I know that you're writing on this theme as well, the issue of populist nationalism. Do you believe that nationalist zeal, as we are seeing the world over actually, and of course also in India, is damaging economic growth?
I think it has the potential to damage. I think it comes, I would define it very simply as the majority community feeling aggrieved that it is being discriminated against. It exists across the world. It exists in India also. And there are people who appeal to this sense of grievance. Now, there are often underlying issues. For example, an issue of jobs. Some of our pretty strong communities in India have started protesting. They want reservations because ultimately it comes down to they're not finding jobs. So I think it's very important to tackle the underlying economic problem, that of creating jobs. But also it is important that we don't fuel the fire by emphasizing the discrimination the majority faces, while ignoring the fact that minorities also historically have faced discrimination. Ultimately, nationalism becomes a play between two disadvantaged groups, except one of the disadvantaged groups now is the majority community. The only way to solve it in some sense is for broader-based economic growth.
Right.
And we need to focus on that as the ultimate solution, rather than emphasize grievances which are politically short-term, very convenient, but have the potential to rip apart the fabric of this country.
But do you believe that nationalism is by definition inward-looking and, as you said, feeds a sense of grievance and therefore anti the principle of openness and open markets and, openness to the world generally? I mean, do you feel nationalism is too inward-looking to be a force of economic growth?
It is inward-looking, and the policies that are often advocated would come in the way of growth rather than promote growth. And to that extent, it is not patriotic. It is nationalistic and therefore divisive, and perhaps has the potential to weaken the country rather than strengthen it. And that's why I think it could be quite dangerous.
Right.
I do think, however, that it is wrong to dismiss the people who are voicing these things and ignore their concerns. I think it's important to understand what they're saying, why they're saying it, and not paper over it by saying these are, rustics and they don't understand, etc. It's important to understand. Ultimately, there is also in many of these protests a sense of identity which is being eroded, and it is, I think, incorrect to say you don't need identity, come merge with us, the global sort of elite who waft around various capitals. It's important to understand that cry also has to be listened to. But we have to do it in a way that enhances the tolerance and respect that people have for one another in the country rather than diminish that.
Right. I'll come to your tolerance question in just a bit because I know that's a question that concerns you. Just a last couple of questions. It's often said that India suffers from a surfeit of democracy, that there's too much democracy in India. Do you believe that democracy is India's strength in pushing us towards faster growth, or is democracy India's weakness?
I think ultimately democracy is a strength. I say ultimately because in the short run, the pushes and pulls of democracy may look as if they stand in the way of growth. And for sure, it's easier to run a road over the objections of the many people whose houses this goes through without paying any attention to them if you were in a more authoritarian regime. And it's much harder to do this in a country like India, where there are so many entrepreneurial politicians who spring up to fight for the rights of those who are being oppressed, and rightfully so. I think longer run it is beneficial because it tends to be more egalitarian, take more people along with it, and recognize when the market system gets skewed towards one group or the other. In a country as varied as India, with the variety of peoples that we have, the variety of languages, etc., I think democracy gives us a certain amount of release of pressure. It allows people to voice their protests, to be heard, and for the system to react. Now, on occasion, what we really need is leadership rather than followership. Leadership which says, okay, I hear you, but even though this is against your short-term interests, this is in our collective long-term interests, and we should go this way. So I don't see leadership as always listening, but I see it as sometimes convincing and saying, we must move in this direction because we have to. It's needed. And so what we have to do is find a way for persuasive leaders to take people in the right path. But would I trade our democracy for anything else? People always pick and choose the authoritarian leader that they want. And my sense is you rarely get the authoritarian leader that you want. You land up with the authoritarian leader you don't want.
You don't want. But you're making a very interesting point that for democracy to succeed and to push growth, it actually has to have a really good leader. It has to have a visionary leader, because democracy without that visionary leader is not going to take you towards growth.
It prevents you from falling too far, because democracy has always the solution, throw the rascals out. But without the appropriate leadership, you can also flounder. So studies of the difference between democracies and authoritarian regimes find that democratic growth is much more stable. Some have even found it as higher. But the most important aspect of democratic growth is it's stable, unlike authoritarian growth where you can get very fast but also very, very slow, as in Mugabe's Zimbabwe or Mobutu Sese Seko's Congo.
Right. Does the rise of illiberal democracy worry you? because the feeling is that democracy's ideological competitor was first fascism, then communism, but now it's illiberal democracy, that is elected autocrats who are
Yeah.
elected through the ballot box, but then who are also autocrats and authoritarian. Just that phenomenon across the world, and of course, in various many countries, does that worry you?
Well, it is worrying. It is often people who appeal to a certain segment of society and have a very strong following. And I think what happens then is the potential for mistakes increases because you're not listening to the broader electorate. These are the people who elected me. I'm going to listen to their will and wishes, and you take countries down the wrong path sometimes. I also think illiberal democracy is not just a function of the leader; it's a function of the system, which kowtows very easily to a strong leader, which doesn't stand up and exercise independence, where the corporate houses, the press, the business groups, all of them essentially tend towards bowing, even though there are exceptions, rather than...
But why do they do that? Why do they do that, in your opinion?
Because their interests are all aligned. And this is where illiberal democracy often is crony capitalism also.
Right.
It's because it's a small group which basically has what North and Weingast call limited access societies, have captured the pathways to wealth, there's a cozy relationship between the political establishment and the corporate establishment. And often, because the press is also owned by the corporate establishment, independent voices tend to get suppressed or drowned. So I think there is a system in which illiberal democracy flourishes, and it's the system also that needs to be tackled then, rather than specific leaders.
Right. Just, on this question of illiberal democracy, a lot of people have seen the Adhaar card, the manner in which the Adhaar card linkages are being pushed to bank accounts, to telephone bills, as a sort of creeping surveillance state, that the state is intruding into the lives of citizens. The citizens are being made accountable to the state, rather than the state being made more transparent and accountable to the citizen. How do you see this, the Adhaar card implementation at the moment? Do you believe that, a card which was designed for welfare is becoming a kind of stick with which to beat citizens and pry into their individual lives, or do you believe that it's actually going all fine?
Well, I mean, in any such venture, we have to have checks and balances, right? We have to have places where people can appeal if the system gets oppressive. Now, there is a very legitimate question which the Supreme Court has asked in how much should the state know and how much should it be able to track you, and what are the safeguards on it using the information it acquires. And I think those are very legitimate questions. It's important that we ask them early, and we have checks and balances to make sure that information is not misused. However, a state which has no information, an incompetent state, is equally problematic. That is, if we don't know where people have hidden their money and we can't enforce tax compliance, we have a very biased governance structure where the poor salaried worker pays their taxes while everybody else runs off and enjoys the money that they've saved from the taxpayer. So I think there is a balance, as with all things. That is, we have to have a process by which we have professional organizations manning these data, and that they have the independence and oversight by the citizenry to make sure the information they have is not misused. We need to go there. We're not there yet. We need to create structures that do that. But if we can do that, then we have a more informed government, but a government which doesn't misuse that information. So I think we need to work on both sides so that the information is acted upon in a reasonable way and brings to the people the gains from that more.
Is that happening? Do you believe there are enough safeguards that the government is, checks and balances are there?
I don't know enough. I mean, this is not an attempt to pop out of that question. I don't know enough about the checks and balances. I do know that we have a Supreme Court judgment, which I thought was a very important one, and I think we need to follow the spirit of that judgment and make sure that we have those processes in place.
You've said in your book that openness is important for economic growth. You've reiterated it just now. But then there are countries, of course, where openness is not there and they have overtaken India in economic growth, such as China. And many believe that the average Chinese is better off than the average Indian. So China, of course, is an example where openness and tolerance is not needed to create an economic powerhouse.
Well, I think you have to look where they start and look where we start and understand that there are important differences there. Two important differences. They started with a much better educated population. So even though people look at per capita GDPs in the 60s and 70s and say China was similar to India, they had a much better educated population at that point. We had much better higher education at that point, but our average population was not as well educated. That's one. Second, we had democracy, they didn't. Okay, those initial starting points do make a difference. So they have been much better at building out infrastructure, at creating investment-led growth, and drawing in a whole lot of foreign firms who benefit from those logistics, etc., with the view first of exporting for international markets using the cheap but educated labor, and now moving on to servicing the Chinese market. So they've had a splendid shift from export-led growth to now they're focusing on domestic demand-led growth. We didn't follow that, partly because we were never strong at building out the infrastructure because of the various constraints on land acquisition, etc., necessary constraints sometimes imposed by democracy. And second, our population hasn't been as well sort of equipped with the kind of education needed to move into the factories at a strong pace that they had. Now, we have to work on both these. These are not insurmountable problems. But I don't think it's the openness which, except for, yes, they've been able to build roads and railroads without asking whose land is being acquired. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a virtue in the long run. In the short run, it does promote for faster growth, which they've had. I think our way is more sustainable and more humane in the long run, and so we shouldn't abandon it, but we should work on improving processes. For example, land acquisition is something that there are states that are doing it very effectively. Mm-hmm. We should learn from the states and develop an all-India bill which allows for experimentation, allows people to move forward if they want. I think that's an area that needs to be tackled post-haste.
Is that the flashpoint you foresee in the future, land? The acquisition of land and how to compensate people?
Well, the flashpoint I see is lack of jobs.
Right.
And so we have to compromise somewhere if we are to actually create more jobs. And building out more infrastructure is a surefire way of creating more jobs. I mean, you've been on all these highways in India and you see the amount of activity that springs up around those highways very quickly. And so logistics improved by building out infrastructure is an important step. I would also say educating our people much better is another step. And we certainly need to look at why scores are diminishing on reading, writing, and so on, and take appropriate steps. very quickly.
Right. In your last book, Fault Lines, and in the last chapter, you actually wrote that the Member of Parliament is a vested interest against development because he needs to control the patronage. He needs to control people coming to him saying, give me a job or give me a hospital bed so he needs to be the fountainhead of patronage. So he doesn't often want development to come because he doesn't want to lose his powers of patronage. Is that an assessment you still have?
Well, I would say that there isn't a strong incentive to change the system. Whether people sort of stand in the way of the system is a stronger claim, which I don't know. But certainly there's not a strong incentive to change the system because the person who has influence, who can call up various people and get things done, is playing a vital role in the system and therefore, finds that role rewarded, either through votes or through contracts and so on. So we are a system where fixers, unfortunately, play too much of a role.
Right.
And to reduce their importance, we have to make the system work better for the ordinary person, which means, government officers should be responsive to the smallest amongst us, to the poorest amongst us. It's only when administration works and works effectively that, in fact, the role of the fixer will be diminished or in fact eliminated. And then people can start thinking about bigger policy. If you're desperate to get a birth certificate for your child who was born in a hut 20 years ago and you have no evidence for that, how do you do that in the current system without a fixer? Because you have no proof. So I think we need to understand the kinds of problems that real people have and have solutions to that problem which doesn't require the intervention of fixers. If we can do that, I think we've come a long way in making our democracy work better, but also making the vote count much more in effective ways.
Right. So what would you do if you were India's finance minister?
I think that the solutions that we need are all out there. That we know what they are, and
what are they?
Well, apart from let me put aside the issue of jobs itself. Having a better job, having the cash that goes with that job itself is part of the answer. Having better education is part of the answer because then you can navigate the current system better. But I also think that the point I made earlier about making the system more competitive, having multiple points of access rather than single points of access, having transparency about the process of access. If I put in a form asking for, let's say, some government benefit or some kind of loan, there has to be a time-stamped response such that if it doesn't come within that time, and not with some frivolous, you didn't do X, Y, Z, which starts the process again, but something which either yes or no, and if no, why precisely no. More automation will help. I think Nandan Nilekani has the right idea that having a more automated system with the right checks and balances can actually help us make the system work much better, and it'll also increase the amount of competition between the various government agencies, which I think would be a good thing. So all these things, I think, really are part of what the ultimate solution will be. We just have to implement. And I think I've always said our major problem is we should have implemented things day before yesterday that we're thinking of implementing tomorrow.
So if you were offered today to come back and assume a government post, would you take it?
Hypothetical question. Okay. I don't answer.
Well, you were recently offered a Rajya Sabha ticket seat by the Aam Aadmi Party, and you refused. Why did you refuse?
See, no comment on whether I was offered anything, but let me just say that when I was in the RBI, people were desperate to get me out to the IMF. When I went back as a professor professor, people are desperate to see me elsewhere. Certainly the press seems to have a new job for me every so often. Look, I'm very happy being a professor and actually professing. I have my brain working, hopefully many hours of the day, and it's a job I like.
Are you at all drawn towards politics, or playing a role in Indian politics?
No. Look, I've said before, the answer is no. I do think there are important policy challenges that India has, and certainly I will opine, as I've opined in this discussion, on those. But on the issue of politics, my wife says very clearly no.